been told not to stretch my hands like this. कैमरे के पीछे से संचित और रोशन दोनों ने thumbs up दे दिया है. I am Aabir Lahiry. You're watching What's Up Aabir. Joining me today in conversation is Ira Mukhoty with her brand new book, The Lion and the Lily: The Rise and Fall of Awadh, the Awadh Kingdom. How are you, firstly?
Thank you for having me here. I'm fine, thanks.
Why the title, The Lion and the Lily?
So, the book actually examines the rise of Awadh.
Okay.
But the backdrop is the Anglo-French global wars that were taking place throughout the 18th century, which we have tended to forget or put in the background. But to a large extent, they affected the way England and France viewed each other and the way in which they reacted to each other in India, and specifically in Awadh. So the lily refers to the lily of France. That was the symbol of France on the banners at that time, the fleur de lis, the old French symbol. And the lion is the lion of Imam Ali to represent the Shia renaissance that the Nawabs created in Awadh.
Baap re, काफी depth.
Soch samajh kar.
So samajh kar. Just take me back in time. How exactly the Awadh kingdom happened? When we look into the history, what do we derive out of history specifically to Awadh kingdom?
Right.
क्या आया, कहाँ से आया? What exactly do we know about it?
So Awadh was initially not meant to be independent at all. It was one of the subas of Hindustan. Even Akbar had named it a suba.
Suba.
So
what
a
is
suba is like an administrative region.
Okay.
So he would put a governor into a suba, and the job of the governor was to make sure people were collecting taxes properly, looking after the place, and sending revenue back to the center, to the Mughal center.
It was not for residential purposes?
Not at all. It was just meant to be administratively looked after. And every 3-4 years, you would transfer the governor.
And I guess Ayodhya was the capital, right? For Awadh?
Ayodhya was the capital, yes. So this was happening regularly through Mughal history. But by the time of the 18th century, after the death of Aurangzeb, things sort of fell apart a little bit. So there was this, next to us there was Persia, which was also crumbling at that time, in the 18th century. So a lot of Persian noblemen and military men were coming into Mughal India, looking for work. So one such man was Sadat Ali. And he was given the Suba of Awadh. And initially he ruled it just as a governor, sending money back to the center. But when Nadir Shah came to Delhi in 1739 and basically destroyed the fabric of the Mughal Empire, really, and the strength of the Mughal emperor at the center, slowly all these provinces stopped sending tax money back to the Mughal center, kept the tax money for themselves, and basically made these subas independent. So after him, his son-in-law became the Nawab, and then his grandson, who was Shuja-ud-Dawla. So by this time, by the time that my book starts in the mid-18th century, it's virtually become a hereditary, independently ruled Nawabi. So it has come from these immigrants from Persia who settled here.
So no, basically how should I say, no bureaucratic system was actually administering the Awadh during that time when the book starts?
That's right. So they are administrating it independently. Yeah.
And how the story goes? What exactly did you cover inside the book? What all is there?
There is a lot.
Because
the 18th century is a really turbulent, interesting time in Indian history.
Britishers came in.
French came in. By then the Portuguese and the Dutch were more or less out of the picture. The French and the British were really tussling over not only India but globally all the empires, especially North America. India was very much part of that tussle. But we are often told, because we get the British narrative, the British point of view, since we are colonial country that has come through British rule, so they tend to make us see the 18th century in terms of the inevitability of British rule, that India was slowly crumbling, nothing was happening, the Mughal emperor was losing all his power. Therefore, it was inevitable that British would take over. But in fact, there was a lot of resistance, from the French, who were there, because they also wanted to counter the British in various areas. And they were interested in doing this via a lot of the local rulers. So Tipu Sultan is one, a very powerful figure who used the French to a great extent, far more than we realize. And there was also Awadh. And the reason I wanted to bring this kind of narrative out is to counter the idea that the Indians were not trying to resist British rule. They were, in fact, the loss of control at the center meant an explosion in the provincial courts. So places like Awadh, Murshidabad, Hyderabad, all these places really came up because those rulers stopped sending money to the center, kept it for their own provinces, and really fostered culture, the arts, patronized buildings, and really created a great deal more than they're given credit for. So I thought through this story, I will show the French also, but also the Nawabs and the Begums, how they created a new center of culture.
Wow. So basically the culture what we see during that time in the mid 18th century is typically a fusion of India as well as Persia, right?
Yes. It's
because
yes.
all those, there's a huge exodus of people from Persia.
Correct.
They came here,
yes.
and that's like a fusion of Indian
Indo-Persianate style is what is found. Yes.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You, when I was reading the back, you speak about powerful Begums, elite eunuchs, soldier, and their adventures. What are these? Let's start from powerful Begums.
Begums, yes.
Because there has been a lot written about them in history.
Yeah.
But what exactly is inside this book and inside Awadh?
So inside this book, there is a group of ladies who are called the Great Begums of Awadh.
Okay.
Beginning with the wife of Shuja-ud-Dawla. Now, Shuja-ud-Dawla, one of the most important landmark events in his life and in Indian history of the 18th century, is the Battle of Buxar.
Okay.
So we often think that the shaping battle of the 18th century was Plassey. But actually that was more just a sleight of hand by Robert Clive. He chanced his luck. He got the Jagat Seths invited him, gave him money, and he kind of, replaced Suraj-ud-Dawla by his own man. But really the Battle of Buxar was when the Mughal Emperor himself, Shah Alam II, decided to fight the British to try and regain his rights, So that was a big deal. So he called his main military man, who was Shuja-ud-Dawla. The Nawabs of Awadh had already become the #1 military power in India by that time, outside of Bengal, outside of the British. So he called Shuja-ud-Dawla, who came to his assistance with his entire force, and this combined Mughal army decided to fight the British at Buxar, but they were defeated. So this was the time when the British really got power over Bengal, because they forced Shah Alam II to sign the Diwani, which is basically handing over the tax collecting rights to the British.
Okay.
So there, for the first time, they got these rights and they were able to access the huge wealth of Bengal. So that was really the shaping battle of that time in history. And for Shuja-ud-Dawla, it meant that he would never again throw in his lot with the emperor, with the Mughal emperor.
Okay.
He decided from
It's like a treaty.
It was like a treaty was made. He had to sign it. And they said, we will give back Awadh to you. The British said, that it was Robert Clive who came to sign this treaty. He said, we have defeated you in battle. We will take your lands unless you pay us this huge war indemnity. Just an arbitrary sum, 50 lakhs, I think, were huge at that time. That if you want to rule your lands again, you will have to pay us this huge war indemnity. Now, Shuja-ud-Dawla by then was bankrupt. He had been fighting for more than a year. No money in the treasury. All his allies quietly went back home and said, "Bhai, we have nothing. Ab chalte. Ab chalte.
Achha chalta hu, duaon mein yaad rakhna."
Exactly. No money to give you. The only person who stood by him was his wife, his main khas Begum, Bahu Begum. So she said, "You can take all the money from my dowry, all my treasures." And she even, it is said, took off her nut that she was wearing and gave him that and said, take all of this.
That's a symbol of pride.
A symbol of pride, of marriage, of all of that. So she made this huge gesture for her husband. Shuja-ud-Dawla gave that money, got back his land, and he never forgot the debt he owed Bahu Begum. And from that time onward, Bahu Begum, he himself writes in his memoirs, she was my confidant and my best friend. So I think that is such a powerful thing to say, about your wife. In those days, he had many wives.
Yeah.
But she was the one that he recognized. Her son was the recognized heir, Asaf-ud-Dawla. And while Shuja-ud-Dawla was alive, she didn't allow any of the other wives even to appear in front of her. They were not even allowed to come in front of her, you know. She had that much power. And he kept all his extra treasure with her. And she had the seal to the government. So she was extremely powerful. Now, when Shuja-ud-Dawla died, Bahu Begum wanted to exert the same kind of power that she had before. She said, together with my son Asaf-ud-Dawla, together we can rule. She had no intention of handing over her money, her wealth and her power to her son. She wanted to, she wanted to rule together.
But why that kind of insecurity?
I just see it as the way in which she felt she could wield power herself. She didn't want to kind of, as a widow, step back into the shadows and only, she felt that she had the money. It was her money. She was very clear about it. This is my inherited money.
And she's the one who actually rejuvenated the entire...
She rejuvenated it. Her husband had deposited more wealth with her for her, not to be given to anybody else.
Okay.
So she saw it as her own wealth to use as she wanted to do. But the British didn't see it the same way. So there were some huge then debacles that happened with Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General, because back home in England at that time, women were not treated like, queens. You were meant to be living a quiet life, and when you got married, you handed over your money to your husband. So women at that time in England were not at all powerful in the way that Bahu Begum was. So these men were very shocked at this attitude, and they resisted her to a great extent, but she resisted back. And so these were women in Parda. She and her mother-in-law, Nawab Begum, they were living in Parda. So they were not stepping out. They were not seen by people. Okay. So how were they able to carry out all their trade and their business and their diplomacy? It was through Khwaja Saras. Now, Khwaja Saras were elite eunuchs. Okay. And so they were able to work in the Zanana because they were elite eunuchs, so they were allowed access. They were the only men who were allowed access. And they could interact with the governors, with the British men, with the other nobility. And so they carried out the orders of the Begums in this way. And
so they were no ministers as such?
They were her preferred ministers, these men, because they came from an ancient system.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that is typically eunuchs?
Correct, because they are allowed into the Zanana. So the women, the Begums, can interact directly with them. You see, they have this close contact. In fact, her most important Khwaja Sara, Jawahar Ali Khan, he used to sleep in the foot of her bed. And in the morning, then leave and go and carry on his business in his room. So they had this special status where they occupied this liminal space between the women's world and the outside world, which the women couldn't cross themselves.
Okay.
So they used these Khwaja Saras to interact with the British.
It's basically a bridge between the palace and the general public and the entire administration.
And what's interesting is, whereas the Europeans used to view eunuchs as effeminate people, as debauched somehow, that image that the Europeans had of the eunuch was very typically in this sort of debased kind of manner, effeminate manner. Interestingly enough, the indigenous sources, the local sources we have, talk of them as very sober and upright men, very virile men. These men, her special Khwaja Saras, are meant to have been very good sportsmen, very good horsemen, and they maintained a huge military strength, and they were very good in battle. So we here had a very different attitude towards eunuchs and their role in society vis-a-vis the Europeans. So when the British had interaction with the eunuchs, they really struggled, and they were not willing to give them the sort of recognition.
Because of their prejudices.
Because of their prejudice, exactly.
Wow. So many interesting things and so many new things I'm learning from this conversation today. I guess, is that the reason why today's society, eunuchs are not given that kind of a respect, because the Britishers colonized us and...
Quite, I think that's...
It's a throwing down effect?
Yeah, I think a lot of the ways in which we view some of our ancient traditions and professions and, classes of people have been hugely influenced by the British system of classification. So for example, if you look at Tawafs, at this very same time, I write a lot about Tawafs because they were extremely cultured, powerful women, right? And all the elite men had courtesans at their court. They were there for singing, for entertainment. They were the number one, attraction of an evening is to have the most cultivated courtesan at your court.
And they were the real superstars around that time.
They were the superstars, exactly. It wasn't Beyonce or, Rihanna. It you would be calling in whoever was the famous courtesan of that area.
Right.
So the Nawabs patronized these courtesans to a great extent, and then that would then in turn foster music and dance. So there was a very vibrant culture of courtly dance and music that was fostered by these Nawabs. Now the British, when they took over in the early 19th century, taking after a little bit after the book ends, they viewed these women as prostitutes. For them, there was no difference. Whereas, in our system, there were grades of Tawaf. Yeah. So there were some were dark Tawafs who would move from city to city. Some were Koti Tawafs. There were all kinds, and there were of course, the lower caste who would be the prostitutes. But there was a whole gradation. But the Brits just put them into the
one category,
called them prostitutes, put them in segregated areas, like in Lucknow they would do that, put them in like red light districts. This is where you will exercise your profession from, did health checks, very demeaning checks on them, and took money from them. And these women were extremely wealthy. In fact, one famous professor has done field work, and Professor Oldenburg, and she has found that at 1857, during the uprising, when they did some kind of survey at that time, these women, the courtesans, were the highest taxpayers of Lucknow. The highest taxpayers. Imagine how much money they were making.
No, I've heard a couple of stories that once Raja said that I request your presence to a courtesan, and she said ऐसा है कि आप पूरी ट्रेन भेजिए, उसके बाद मैं आऊँगी.
Yeah.
So they were that powerful around that time.
They were, yeah.
Wow. So you were just mentioning some time back that Indian indigenous culture was typically not that patriarchal in nature. It is Europeans and typically the West Europeans, what we are talking about, who were very patriarchal in nature, and they never gave that kind of respect to the women, and they never thought that women can also be in power.
Yes.
Do you also think that that also flows down from there? Because today's society is, let's agree to the fact that it is slightly patriarchal. If not slightly, it may be quite patriarchal. And we have actually moved into that particular path what they made us move.
I think so. I think, in the 19th century, the sort of British people who were coming in, to India were Protestant. They were very austere men. It was a sort of Protestantism which is called like evangelical Protestantism. So it is exemplified by moral rigidity, and they used to think that everything Indian, everything to do with the Hindu religion, everything was debased, everything was degraded, and everything was full of superstition, and everything was full of, all sorts of evils which had to be, done away with. So they brought in this attitude of needing to, in a way, almost clean up the system, anesthetize the whole thing. And then eventually, it was adopted, this whole morality was adopted in the 20th century even by the nationalist movement. They wanted women to be a certain way because they wanted anything to do with, for example, tawaifs and courtesans and all of that side of our culture to be removed, so that women, it is again back into the ambit of the pure women, the women who are within the patriarchal system, the married women. These are the women who should exercise music and dance, for example. So music left the domain of the courtesan and came into middle class houses. So it was also then fostered by the people who who worked with the nationalist movement, and then it became ingrained in our system.
So colonial hangover में हम सिर्फ आज नहीं हम तब भी थे.
कब से, yes.
What is the learning for all the common man who may be reading this book or maybe doing some kind of a research or is very curious about history, specifically to Awadh? What is one thing they can actually learn out of it?
See, there's several things you can learn out of it. I think one thing that has been very exciting, interesting for me to realize is the way in which the British were doing this sort of propaganda in a very systematic manner. So in 1947, for example, when they were leaving, they took all the documents that they had relating to their rule in India, all the documents from the Red Fort, everything that they had, and burnt everything. They had started a thing called Operation Legacy. So in every ex-colony that they were leaving, they were burning up and destroying all the documents which they felt were incriminating to them about their rule in that country, because they felt that they could not fall into so-called sensitive hands, i.e. locals. So rather than that happen, they destroyed or took back to England, where there they were kept in safekeeping. Even probably we haven't seen it to this day. So what they wanted to do was, in their own words, they wanted people to retain the notion of Britain and think of them as a benevolent and to think of them with respect and with affection. Right? So they destroyed things that reminded people of what had happened and replaced it with a sense of gratitude towards whatever the British had accomplished. So then that takes us back to Awadh and makes us wonder how much of what they told us and have left in their historical records is actually very misleading, and is actually sometimes outright false and it's full of lies. So now, once I knew that, I was able to look at data and look at historical evidence with a more critical eye. And if you then look at it like that, you realize a lot of it is outright false. So the way in which they've written about the Begums was very untrue. The way there's a rebellion called Chet Singh's rebellion of Benares. You know, they were asking him for yet more money one time, and he refused because he couldn't. They imprisoned him, and the whole city erupted to make him escape from that imprisonment, and against the British. They almost killed Hastings. He had to run away from there in a boat. So we don't remember all of this. We don't remember that these people put up a lot of resistance because what the British were doing was really unfair. And so once you do that, I think readers will perhaps appreciate that what we have been told is a sort of very monochromatic, linear image, you know, idea of how these processes took over. But what they may see is that there was resistance really, and very interesting forms of resistance, you know, like the Begums trying to resist. And this Raja, whom they were not expecting, a young guy, he had just come to the throne, his people resisted to such a great extent, you know. So this kind of opposition to what we thought as, you know, overwhelmingly huge British power happened all the time. So that is something that people might find interesting.
Very cool. How exactly a historian writes? Because this book was kept at my desk and a couple of people read it. They're like, oh wow, historian. And that actually reminded me of the question, like, how do you guys research? Because it's a tedious job. I actually found history very boring when I was in class 7th, 8th. I was learning social studies. It's a part of social studies. I'm like, oh, bhai, ye sab kaise padunga? But now with age, when I grew up, I actually started enjoying it more and more. But what exactly goes into the mind of a historian when you are writing such a huge book with a lot of research, of course, because bina research ke to aayega nahi.
No, I know.
And mostly research is not available. How do you do that?
So I think the problem with probably why you found it boring is that the way we are taught it with
that's also a problem.
You know, dates and names. Who can remember dates and names?
That's also
impossible.
a problem.
Yeah.
I really want this to change actually.
This has to change.
Civics and history should actually be changed and taught by storytellers, like good storytellers.
Look, that's what history is, really. It's the story of just humans, you know, so other life stories of different humans. So, in fact, you know, I was listening to somebody else talk and he was saying historians have to do a little bit of, learnings from anthropology, from geography, because you have to know that, from linguistics, from art history, because we bring in a lot of art history into our work. All kinds of aspects of just human existence. Because what am I describing? The 18th century, people's lives. So you need to bring that, alive. And I think you can only do that by placing people in that context and bringing it alive, so that people relate to it. You know, if you just have a list of names and places and dates, then no one can relate to it or feel that these people actually lived and breathed. So I think, for example, in terms of you asking about research, this was a particularly challenging book because of the global nature of the players involved. So you have French adventurers, you know, you have British men, you have people who are going back to different European countries, and then you have the Nawabs, you have the Afghans, you have the Rohillas, you know, this huge cast of characters. So it was very challenging. It is the book for which I have traveled the most and gone to the most museums and libraries and things like
Next
that.
Next time, make me your bag holder. I'll travel with you to learn this kind of history.
It was very fascinating. But the one quick point about sources and what brings things to life, I was researching Warren Hastings, and you know, he was. I find that he was very misrepresented. We think that compared to Robert Clive, he was much better. He was an Indologist. He had learnt Persian, so he's a better man. But I found him very venal, you know, always chasing money and behaving really outrageously with the Begum. So I was struggling to bring him to life in a more human way. And then at the British Library, I was looking through documents, and there was one diary of his where he writes about staying with Asaf-ud-Daula for 5 months in 1784.
Okay.
So he writes every day in his copper plate handwriting, you know, that old style. And on one page, he has written the full recipe for kebab khatai. Asaf-ud-Daula's kebab khatai. He must have enjoyed it one day. The Nawab got it made for him. So I took a picture of that recipe. It's fully written there with, you know, 2 kgs of onion, this many kgs of meat and all that. Marinate, everything is written in it. I took a picture at the British Library and I posted it on Twitter. And then I finished my research, I took the tube, went back home. By the time I went home and checked Twitter, it had blown up because people loved seeing this recipe so much. Just this 18th century Warren Hastings writing down, you know, kebab khatai. So just to let you know that people love these details, just to show the human side, that he may have been corrupt, he may have been venal, but he enjoyed his kebabs, you know, and he was interested in doing this kind of culinary experiment.
Sounds very interesting. What should anybody who's interested in history do? Like, ab age nikal gayi. For example, I can't go back to school and learn history. I can't go back to NCERT books and start learning history again. What should I actually do? Engage with these books, or there is a different way to...
I think, you know, if you're doing this later in life, then this is a great way to do it, because you now have a whole bunch of writers of narrative history who are coming out for the past 20 years. You know, we've seen the example, of course, it started with William Dalrymple, but then we've had many writers in India doing the same, writing very successfully. Another way I find personally is podcasts. I listen to, you know, a bunch of podcasts on history, and somehow, you know, when you're doing something and your attention is just on what people are saying, I find you imbibe a lot of information that way, you know, instead of sitting and trying to focus on the writing. So sometimes that is a very good way of learning history, and there are some great historical podcasts as well.
Why not films? You know, the West have done a fantastic
such a
job.
Great tradition.
Yeah, they have done a fantastic job with
we
films.
We are really lacking in that.
I guess I have seen only a couple of films. Jodha Akbar was one. Uske alawa, I can't remember any.
I can't think of anything either, and we keep waiting for that great, you know, Netflix series. Make a Netflix series on.
This is such a wonderful topic.
So
Awadh, Mughal.
Yeah, it's Game of Thrones. And the Mughals are Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
You don't have to invent anything. All that backstabbing, deceit, everything is happening, right?
And not only that, Guptas, Cholas, lot of histories.
Indian history is just the most exciting.
And the good part is it's documented as well.
It is.
It may not be very extensive set of documents, but it is well documented.
There is enough to certainly make something interesting.
Like a film.
You know? Yeah.
You should make a film.
If there's any producer out there, why not?
Any producer out there who have got $1,000-2,000 nahi, itne mein nahi banta. Matlab, for a good web series with 9-10 episodes, you need that kind of money.
Right.
अब वो भी एक problem है ना, किसका interest होगा, किसका नहीं होगा.
But look at right now they've made Shogun.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
So I just started seeing it, and I'm like, okay, at least they're making, you know, why can't we make it on the similar kind of principle?
Yeah. It's a huge research. Plus, to make history relevant for all the big masses is also a big task, because you should have a fantastic screenplay writer who will capture the essence on screen.
Yes,
good actors, good star cast. Budget बहुत ज़्यादा ऊपर हो जाएगा. Budget बहुत ज़्यादा ऊपर हो जाएगा. कुछ interesting thing which I may have missed during this conversation, which you would like to highlight around Awadh?
Around Awadh, well, we haven't talked about the culture very much. So that was just an aspect that came up. What I found very interesting was that the Nawabs were Shia Persians, you know, because they came from Persia, so they brought Shia Islam with them. And as they started investing more and more time and money and resources into Awadh, they started fostering a culture that was based around Shia expressions of piety. So they started building imambaras. Imambaras did not exist in this area before that. They started in the 16th century in the Deccan, but there hadn't been any really in this region. And the ones that Asaf-ud-Daula...
Is this the one?
Wait, where is this?
I think so.
Oh my God. Yeah, I think so.
This is the one.
I was wondering what you were looking at. Just see.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they started building imambaras.
They did. They built imambaras, and they fostered this culture of Muharram and all the rituals around the commemoration of Imam Ali, Imam Hussain. And little by little, they brought in the whole population into this cultural milieu. So imagine that the Shias were tiny proportions. Say in 1800 there were about 11 million people.
Globally?
No, in Lucknow.
Oh, in Lucknow.
Yeah, in Awadh, let us say.
In Awadh.
Out of that, 10% were Muslims, mostly Sunnis. So Shia were a handful of people. Yet by the end, say by 1800, almost all of Lucknowi and Faizabadi, you know, urban culture was based around these kind of expressions of piety. So everybody kind of adopted it. They started using the same symbols, say the same imagery that they used on the imambaras and on the mosques and on the gateways. They started using them on Jain temples, on Hindu temples. So, you know, there was a real exchange and melange, and everybody came together in this sort of elite culture which became very emblematic of Lucknow and which today remains in the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb that they have. But it really started in this way of drawing all of the population into this remembrance, which had a lot of resonance with things like Dussehra festivals, Jagannath rituals, all these processions which are very much part of Indian traditions. The Shia Nawabs took those on because they also patronize Holi and Diwali and all these things. So they made a kind of melange in which every citizen kind of participated in whatever way they wanted to.
Wow. Very cool, very cool. So, Awadh was basically a land between Ganga and Yamuna, right?
Yes, it is the Doab area.
What exactly do we see? अगर आज के मैप पे देखेंगे तो where exactly is Awadh?
Today it
UP is entirely Awadh.
UP. So Allahabad, Benares, Lucknow, that whole region. It was right up to the Himalayas, the lower Himalayas. Yes, the Uttarakhand, just up to that border. So they considered it a buffer zone between the British and Bengal and the Mughals at Delhi. So this whole region was Awadh. With Rohilkhand across
it was
the top.
Epicenter for all the administration and everything.
Exactly, and the rivers came through. So all the trade was happening through the rivers here.
How was the music there? I'm a big fan of music.
The music was extremely important because the Nawabs loved music, and they patronized the courtesans and musicians independently. So what was happening at this time was that because Delhi was losing power, because Nadir Shah, then Ahmed Shah Abdali, then one after the other there were raids happening on Delhi. So Delhi had become a very insecure, volatile place. So all the great poets and musicians and dancers and noblemen and women all came to the sub-imperial zones of power. So Murshidabad, Awadh, Lucknow, Hyderabad. So many came to, therefore, Lucknow. It became a great center of poetry, music and dance and art. So music was like constantly
just imagine an evening in actually Lucknow.
Yeah.
कहीं पे poetry चल रही है, कहीं पे कबाब बन रहे हैं, कहीं पे गाने चल रहे हैं.
बिल्कुल. And the fun thing is, so the British were there also. They had their residency and they were living there. So they started their day very early because it was so hot for them. They couldn't manage. So they would start really early, 5 o'clock, go for horse riding and all that, do their administrative duties through the heat. And then by 6, 7 o'clock say that's it, we are done for the day, have a cold bath and think of going to sleep. And at that time the Nawab was starting कि अब हम उठेंगे, अब हम अब महफिल करेंगे, अब start हो जाए. So 10 o'clock was when the poets would start their recitation.
10 in the night?
10 at night.
Wow. Wow.
So then till
imagine
early
a British
morning,
sleeping and literally snoring and you start.
Exactly.
Wow.
And as the poets were going home at dawn, the Brits were waking up.
क्या 24-hour का cycle है? What a beautiful cycle this is. How was food? Like you mentioned about kebab and everything.
So food
we certainly love Awadh food and everything. It's a very integral part of Indian culture.
It is.
But how exactly? How have been transformed? How has the food transformed from that time to now?
From that time to now, so
do we still get to see the essence of real, authentic Awadh food?
There is still a lot because people are very attached to their culinary traditions. At least in Lucknow, I found that when I went to do a bit of field work, and I was lucky enough to go to people's homes, and food is, I think, it's one of the things that ties us to our culture. It's one of those intangibles that we associate with our culture.
Right.
The way one place eats a certain thing, another place may not have it, and the exchanges that happen. So it was a very rich cuisine, and no doubt people don't eat now the way I remember when I was writing it, that when Shujauddaulah would come to Bahu Begum's palace to have lunch, because he had promised her he would come every day to have lunch with her. That was one of the rules, written agreements. So they would have food sent to him from 6 kitchens. So each kitchen, his kitchen, Bahu Begum's kitchen, mother-in-law's kitchen, brother-in-law Salar Jung would send from his kitchen, and then the Khwaja Saras would send from their kitchens. So 6 kitchens would be sending their food and their specialities for the Nawab to have. So clearly today that doesn't happen. People can't eat on that kind of scale. But when they get together, I think for celebrations or for entertainment, hospitality, it's still very much that sense of pride in the cuisine that has come through the ages.
And did all the 6 kitchens have their own specialties?
They did.
And own taste, own palate?
Absolutely. So they would often, the great kitchens, you would have a main chef who would cook only 1 or 2 specialities.
Okay.
And in small quantities. The large quantity cooking was left to a lower chef. So the top chef would only cook.
Like a 5-star restaurant.
Bilkul.
You'll get 2 chammach of biryani and pay $5,000 for it.
So hopefully that didn't happen. They were paid really well. The top chefs were paid like incredibly high salaries for their time. And they would specialize in 1 or 2 things. And then you had a specialist who would make the breads, different types of, sheermal and rotis and all of that. Oh my God, can you imagine?
You still go to Chandni Chowk and you go to Jama Masjid area, you can
still
actually
get.
Yeah, the real essence of, I don't know how, I was not alive, maybe in Purane Janam mein agar main hu, but I can't decipher the fact कि 1857 में शीरमाल कितना अलग होगा और अब कितना अलग होगा, but अभी भी जो है,
it's
fantastic.
It's
fantastic. Super. On that note, I guess it's for all the readers to decode what exactly is inside this book and to soak in history in its true sense. The rise and fall of Awadh, how exactly it rose, how exactly it fell. The Lion and the Lily by Ira Mukhoty is up for grabs. You can grab it from a bookstore near you, online. अब तो सब कुछ मिल रहा है. E-book भी आ चुका होगा, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for having this conversation.
So
it's lovely to know these kind of anecdotes, and it's good for me to actually soak in these kind of information. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.